The Montana Wildlife Federation is really animated by a 90-year-old concept called the North American Model of Wildlife Management. This compares to the king's deer in Europe, where game species were owned by nobility. In the United States, it's owned by the public trust. We want it professionally and scientifically managed, no overt commercialization of public trust wildlife, the equitable allocation of those species, because a lot of people, this is how they put protein on the table for their family. So it should be done in an equitable, democratic manner.
Welcome to The Trail Less Traveled, an adventure radio series and podcast dedicated to collecting stories and sounds from around the world in order to take you back to mankind's earliest form of entertainment, storytelling. Missoula, Montana is a mecca for outdoor enthusiasts, and each week we will bring you tales of adventure from both near and far, as well as information and inspiration and a few tunes to set the mood. You can subscribe to the podcast and learn about our international outreach projects at traillesstraveled.net. And now, here's your host, international expedition guide, conservationist, and yogi, Mandela.
I'm currently sitting in the forest in the mountains outside Missoula. There's a light, steady drizzle. The leaves are changing color. And I'm sitting here with Frank Szollosi. He is the executive director of the Montana Wildlife Federation. He has been with the Montana Wildlife Federation since 2020. And he's been involved with the National Wildlife Federation since 2008. Frank is a father of 4. He's married to Wednesday. They've been together for over 30 years. He's originally from Toledo, Ohio. And Frank enjoys fishing and bird hunting and living in Montana. So first I want to just start by saying thank you so much, Frank, for setting aside the time and energy to sit with me in the rain today.
Well, thank you, Mandela. Wouldn't call it rain. I would call it a drizzle.
I want to start by asking you about the evolution of you as a conservationist. Tell us about your journey, how you got to where you are today, your mentors, your parents, the ecosystem in Toledo. This is an international audience, so not everyone listening knows about Ohio,
right,
compared to Montana. So the first question is, where did you grow up and how was adventure and conservation a part of your childhood?
Mandela, thank you for the question. I was born in Toledo. My mom was born in a little Hungarian village just inside Slovakia, under the gaze of the Carpathian Mountains. Toledo itself in northwest Ohio, and it was indigenous land. It was once something called the Great Black Swamp. Settlers came and drained the swamp. There was the site of a pretty important naval battle in 1812 between the British and the young United States. That part of the country is also known for great perch fishing and great walleye fishing, great waterfowl hunts along to the west side of Lake Erie there. The major natural feature in my life growing up, we'd get out and get on sailboats on it, catch fish, play hide and seek in the dark nearby, catch fireflies. In western Lake Erie, there's a place called Cedar Point, which is, we call it roller coaster capital of the world. It just always loomed large in our imagination. It was out on this strip of land going out into the lake. It's still there. It's an amazing place. It was a great childhood. I had 4 beautiful grandparents. I had a brother. My grandpa built us a tree house. He taught us how to carve slingshots to try to keep squirrels away from the walnut trees and the cherry trees. And so when we had our kids, we bought a house in Toledo up against what's called Swan Creek Preserve Metro Park. It's about 1,000 acres, and there are big turtles and deer and coyotes and all kinds of birds. We brought our girls out to Missoula, but in some ways they were actually closer to the forest back in Toledo because, literally the trees from the forest would brush up against the back of our house. I'm skipping quite a bit, jumping from my childhood to where we raised our children in Toledo. I left Toledo for the University of Utah in Salt Lake City in 1990. After graduating high school, I had gone to D.C., actually to Georgetown, for a high school government course and met kids from all over the country. I knew that I wanted to leave home, find a place that was easy to get into and was relatively inexpensive. And the University of Utah fit that. And so in 1990, I flew out to Salt Lake City, learned how to ski, learned how to backpack in Red Rock, southern Utah, learned how to fly fish, and just really fell in love with mountains. That's where I met my wife. She was at the ballet school, and we just had the idea that maybe one day we would come back out west. And so after 20 years in Northwest Ohio, about 10 years with the National Wildlife Federation's office in Ann Arbor, there was an opportunity to come and lead the Montana Wildlife Federation. And so I'm really grateful that the board of the MWF hired me 5 years ago, and it's been a great run. And it's a real privilege to serve in this capacity.
Tell us a little bit about where you said your mom came from.
Yeah, my mom was born in a little town called Janek, Slovakia. But if you go there, all the little signs are both in Hungarian and in Slavic. Hungary used to be much larger than it is today. But Wednesday and I went there to see the house that she was born in. I remember this, really beautiful old lady walking past this little farmhouse, and she tapped herself and she said, Emma Christ Mama, Emma Christ Mama. It was my mom's godmother. My grandfather left. He was actually born in a coal company town in southeast Ohio in 1920. My great-grandparents moved him back to Hungary at that time because they didn't like being coal miners in southeast Ohio. And he sort of rode out World War II as a U.S. citizen in a jail in eastern Slovakia. It's really somewhat of a miracle that I'm here, considering the number of people who died in Eastern Europe during World War II. And so one of the songs is a Hungarian gypsy folk music song.
Nice.
Because it reminds me of my late grandparents and just so many important people to me and my family back in Toledo, Ohio. And have had the great privilege to visit Hungary and eastern Slovakia to see where my mom was born and where my grandparents were from. And then on my dad's side, they were from a town in southeast Hungary called Szeged, which is known for its wine and its fields of poppies and sunflowers. And there's just generations of Szollosis down there in southeast Hungary. On a personal level, pains me to see, what's happening in Ukraine. And, the fight for liberty is a lot like the work here in Montana as far as, the fight for the public trust wildlife, public land, and habitat. History really repeats itself. Each generation sort of has to stand in the breach to defend certain values, I think, and principles, or else, because they're valuable, the elk here in Montana, access to streams, into the fishing is very, very valuable. And if defenders of the public trust and the common good don't stand in that breach, then it'll be overrun by folks who want to turn it into a money-making operation. We're not against businesses or people who make a living by any means, but you can't, the tragedy of the common says you just can't overwhelm it. You have to find the balance. And for 90 years, the Montana Wildlife Federation has stood for really balancing the interests of landowners, people who subsist on elk and deer and wild fish and other game species. And so the Federation provides public service work, and I've just always been attracted to that. When I was back in Toledo a long, long time ago, I was elected to Toledo City Council twice.
Nice.
And so there were some high points in those days, and there were some low points in those days, but my mom and my dad, my brother, my grandfather were all elected officials back there. My late grandfather served in World War II in the Navy. Our son is a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. He's serving overseas now. And, we've just always had a sense of appreciation for our country, for this country. I guess what makes me tick is a desire to give back somehow. And I see the Federation as an opportunity to do that professionally. It's been great. It's been a fun run.
Frank, I want to ask you about one time in your early childhood where you had an epiphany, whether you were just running around the forest as a boy, that made you feel that connection to wanting to advocate for the public lands and waters and wildlife.
Yeah, I remember being in the church basement, and I was standing with my grandfather and Father Hernati, who ended up marrying me a few years later, but he tried to get me to join the priesthood. I remember that conversation well. I remember climbing a tree and in the dark and putting my hand on a limb and then all of a sudden having a bat. I put my hand on a bat's wing, and it was like trying to get itself free, and right in front of me, I could see that bat's face right now.
Yeah.
Needless to say, I pushed off and fell about 5 or 6 feet out of that tree. That was quite the memory. You know, Toledo is also home to the Maumee River. It's the largest river system that empties into the Great Lakes. And I brought my kayak from Toledo. Our kids grew up on kayaks on the Maumee River and some of the streams that feed it. And just the quiet stillness of it, the cranes and the cardinals, I was just animated by it and grateful to find that beauty back in the Midwest where I grew up. And so I feel good trying to defend that for this and future generations. You and I were on the shoulders of giants here with the Federation. I mean, our board now, the board over the years, the contributions that the Federation's made, and every bipartisan or nonpartisan conservation victory that goes back to the 1930s. If it's not clear by now, my favorite subject growing up was history.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of history that I've come prepared to talk about.
Well, we're going to dive into that when we come back. That's the voice of Frank Szollosi. He is the executive director of the Montana Wildlife Federation. So when you hear Frank say the Federation, or MWF, that's what he's saying, the Montana Wildlife Federation. Frank, I'd like to talk to you about the story behind the formation of the Montana Wildlife Federation, how it came to be, and a little bit of the story of this part of the world where we sit right now.
Mandela, great question. Wildlife, habitat, public land, the drivers of what animates Montana Wildlife Federation precede the formation of Montana Wildlife Federation. For time immemorial, indigenous communities harvested bison, caribou, elk, salmon on free-flowing rivers, hunted and fished according to traditional and native ways. In the 19th century, in the wake of the Lewis and Clark expedition, we'll call them people of European descent, came out here. A lot of it was really intensified by railroads in mining, and the bison were wiped away, millions of bison. By 1925, there were only about 3,000 antelope left in Montana. That die-off continued through the 1970s when there were just maybe 300 grizzly bears left. And so over the course of 200 years, European settlers nearly wiped out the biodiversity here in what's now western Montana and across the northern Rockies, including southern Canada. And so inroad, as the mythologizing goes, inroad New Yorker Theodore Roosevelt, who fell in love with what he saw out here, who was reacting to the loss of his mother and his wife on the same day back in New York City when he was serving up in Albany. And the conservation ethic grew. Aldo Leopold in Wisconsin sort of pioneered scientific wildlife management in the early 20th century. And President Franklin Roosevelt, who was inspired by his Uncle Teddy, inspired by the natural world that he grew up in a very privileged way, decided, he was always trying to outdo his Uncle Teddy. And so he went with a guy by the name of Ding Darling, who was a cartoonist for newspapers, who also happened to be an early conservationist. And they got together with FDR's first Secretary of Interior, a guy by the name of Harold Ickes. And they said, we need to build political support for our conservation platform in the Congress here in the 1930s. Of course, he was elected in a landslide in 1932 and took office in 1933. And he asked Ding Darling and Harold Ickes to go out and organize, at that point, almost 20,000 rod and gun clubs across the country, across the states, garden clubs. At that point, many birds were on their way to extinction because of the style at the time. People liked plumage in hats. And not just in this country, but, the exports of various feathers and things surged. And so 8 men from Montana answered the call in 1936 to go to the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. for the first General Wildlife Conference under the auspices of the Roosevelt administration. And FDR spoke, And I think I have what he said here. Opening the meeting, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stated that the purpose of the meeting was to bring together individuals, organizations, and agencies interested in the restoration and conservation of wildlife resources. My hope is that through this conference, new cooperation between public and private interests and between Canada, Mexico, and this country will be developed, that through these proposals, existing state and federal governmental agencies and conservation groups can work cooperatively for the common good. And the 8 individuals came back to Montana and organized the Montana Wildlife Federation. And that happened in states across the country. And the first bill that they worked on was Pittman-Robertson, where hunters decided to tax themselves to generate revenue for conservation finance, for the restoration of species and habitat. And so that really demonstrates that even at that point, hunters were putting their money where their mouth was. And Pittman-Robertson led to Dingell-Johnson, a tax on fishing equipment and boats, so that revenue could be poured back into helping our aquatic resources become restored and thrive into the future. Really, the list is too long to get into as far as everything that's been done over the course of almost 90 years of the Federation. You and I have this great good fortune to work with a woman by the name of Kathy Hadley. Kathy Hadley, at one point, was the only woman on a board for the Montana Wildlife Federation. The board at that point was 40 people. One woman, 39 men. She and her late husband, Wayne, were ranchers, and he worked for the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And Kathy was present at the creation and helped guide such really formative things in the 1980s, such as the block management program, which opens up access on private land to reduce the pressure that landowners in Montana get from game damage. Elk can be pretty destructive to working land. And by using hunting as a management tool, they opened up access. So it was a win-win for the Montana hunter and the Montana landowner. She was also present at the creation for another conservation finance innovation called Habitat Montana that allows landowners to petition the state for a conservation easement on their land. They get tax benefits and a payment in exchange for a legally binding agreement not to subdivide their land. And habitat fragmentation is a driver of species loss and the biodiversity crisis. And so, Montanans like unspoiled vistas. They like intact landscapes. And the Habitat Montana program is really the gold standard state program to keep habitat intact across the country. And we continue to build on that success today. In 2020, the passage of the recreational cannabis ballot measure was designed so that 40% of that revenue could go into Habitat Montana. This past year, we expanded its scope and purpose to allow for highway crossings, which provide safety for travelers, but also allows for migration routes, which have more pressure on them now as Montana grows in population and there are more roads and more human development. Migratory routes for ungulates and things like grizzly bears have been very negatively impacted. And so wildlife crossings, we're really grateful that it's gotten bipartisan support, even in these polarizing times. Support for wildlife crossings comes from everyone from Governor Gianforte to pretty good numbers on the Republican side of the caucus, as well as the Democratic caucus in Helena. We're just scratching the surface of what the Montana Wildlife Federation does. And in its early years, most of the leadership of the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks sat on the board of the Wildlife Federation because it was a bridge to your everyday hunter and angler, folks who wanted to increase their knowledge of scientific management of species. Stock growers and other big landowners wanted to be involved because it was a conversation that led to win-win solutions and, efficiencies and sustainable harvest of different kinds of species important to really generations of Montanans. And so we're really on those shoulders today. We have to look out over the course of another 90 years and deal with not just human development per se, as far as fragmentation on the landscape, but climate change. It really is changing snowpack, changing the fire regime in our forests. It's changing when and where we can catch cutthroat trout. It's imperiling great species in Montana. And the other thing that it's doing is that it's increasing the phenomena of human migration away from, places that are going to get hotter quicker, like the Southeast and the Southwest and Southern California. And more people are going to come to temperate places like Montana. And so it's just really important for organizations like ours to work with legislators and agencies to really insist that they use the best available science, and that includes climate science in their forecasting and in their management. And just as I mentioned, Aldo Leopold and his pioneering work on, scientific wildlife management in the early 20th century, we have to do that with climate science in the 21st century. And, no amount of elected officials putting their head in the sand is going to change physics. Montana Wildlife Federation in 2015 and again in 2023 put out a scientific report on the impact of climate to wildlife and habitat in Montana. And you can get that on the Montana Wildlife Federation website.
Now, Frank, I was hoping that we could start by sharing the mission of the Montana Wildlife Federation.
Very simply, Montana Wildlife Federation exists to defend critical wildlife in Montana, habitat, to protect and expand public land, and access to our natural resources, whether it's our native fishery or game species, but also non-game species. And so we're driven by the best available science. We're driven by a legal concept called the public trust, that wildlife in a particular state belongs to all people and are managed by the state on behalf of all people. And so if an elk happens upon your property, it's not your elk, right? And so with more and more folks coming in to buy land and to purchase property in Montana, a lot of what we do is education, so that, hey, if you bought something here, Montana has a conservation ethic that, we believe the management of wildlife should adhere to the North American model of wildlife conservation, that, one of its bedrocks is the public trust doctrine. One of its bedrocks is the use of best available science. One of its bedrocks is that commodification and the privatization of these public goods don't happen. And so, we're an advocacy group. The Montana Wildlife Federation is, made up of, at this point, 18 board members from across the state, 16, local clubs across the state, thousands of members, even more supporters, people who take action now online. We mainly engage at the legislative and administrative levels, but we have in the past and are currently in litigation on the judicial side. We work with tribes for water rights, for tribal sovereignty, for food security, for the preservation of access to traditional hunting lands and sites of great cultural importance to them, going back centuries, that will be important to them for centuries to come. And we defend public land. This past summer, the summer of 2025, there was a great threat to public land across the country. A Utah senator wanted support to liquidate vast tracts of public land across the country. In the 1980s, it happened before, under Interior Secretary James Watt and the so-called Sagebrush Rebellion. There were folks back then, the states, that sought to liquidate federal public land and put it on the fast track to be privatized. And so it came up before, it came up this year, and I have no doubt that it's going to happen again. And so kudos to Mandela, all your listeners who took action this summer to defend public land. This great rally in Missoula, there were probably 3,000 people there, but there were people rallying in East Glacier and West Glacier and Gardner and in Billings and, in small towns across Montana and across the West. One of the great stories of this past summer was somebody overheard Senator Barrasso in the halls of the Congress bemoaning the fact they're marching in Cheyenne. They're marching in Cheyenne. And, Wyoming's a pretty conservative state. And if they're marching in Cheyenne, you know that a third rail's been touched. We were there to electrify that rail as best we could so that Senator Mike Lee or, anybody who's foolish enough to touch that rail again can feel it. And so that's the power of the conservation movement. It exceeds the activities of one group like ours, the Montana Wildlife Federation. And individuals are part of it, other organizations, businesses, other elected officials. And it's important to our economy here in Montana. It's important to our sense of ourselves. And as I mentioned, it's important to the cultures that were here before us and who will continue to be here.
That's the voice of Frank Szollosi. He is the executive director of the Montana Wildlife Federation. We're talking about advocacy. We're talking about public lands. If you're listening and you're not yet already a member of the Montana Wildlife Federation, please join. MontanaWildlife.org is the website. It's $40 a year for individual membership, $80 for a family, $20 for a youth. And many of the reasons why the people listening right now live in Montana, many of those reasons include something to do with public lands. And here in Montana, we have quite a lot of public land. So I'm not surprised to have seen what happened this summer as people stood up and advocated for public lands. But like you said, we need to stay vigilant because we know that something like that may happen again. In this day and age, sometimes it seems like a lot of folks are apathetic. And there is a famous quote, apathy towards the planet is mankind's ticket to extinction. But I feel like the Montana Wildlife Federation educates you about what's going on and then empowers you to help use your voice effectively. Because a lot of people don't know what to do. How can they help? But I feel like the Montana Wildlife Federation gives you those tools. Tell us a little bit about that.
We engage locally. Our outgoing board chair, Chris Ravine, goes and interacts with county commissioners. Like Missoula County Commissioners just passed a resolution to defend Montana backcountry and oppose the rescission or the reversal of something called the roadless rule, which prevents road building in wilderness and other unspoiled areas, millions of acres in Montana, 60 million acres across the country. Sadly, the Department of Agriculture is seeking to reverse that 25-year-old rule. Folks engage all the time with the state legislature, with the Montana Fish and Wildlife Commission, with various other state boards. We stood up an ambassador program to try to pull new, young, hungry conservationists into an organized approach to advocacy. We call it the ambassador program. One ambassador came through. His name's Mike Mershon. He's a small business guy in Billings, Montana. He would pipe in and testify in front of the state legislature. He would pipe in and testify in front of the Fish and Wildlife Commission. He got the hang of it. He got good at it. He was invited to join the board of the Montana Wildlife Federation a few years ago because of his activism. And this spring, his colleagues on the board had elected him to be the president and board chair. And so, we believe in leadership development pipeline, empowering people who know in their gut that they need to do something and to step up. But it's organizations like ours, and we're certainly not the only organization that does it. But, we'll give you the advocacy tools to pipe in and pipe up on behalf of wildlife, habitat, and access across Montana. And we do the same thing at the federal level. Twice a year, we'll recruit folks from Montana to do a fly into Capitol Hill or to go to the administration and sit down and talk about federal matters. And right now, our cup runneth over on the federal side. They want to weaken the Endangered Species Act. They want to roll back common sense regulations that put conservation on the same even keel as energy development. They want to privilege energy development. They talk about picking winners and losers. They want to pick winners and losers now. And the losers are going to be the public good to the benefit of investor-owned corporations. We're out for the public good. We're not looking to try to see scales tip towards folks who are commodifying our national forests in Montana or the grasslands that they want to open up for more coal mining. It's a tough situation right now. And a lot of folks, it's so tough that some folks are, feeling overwhelmed and burned out. And, the great thing about the Wildlife Federation is that our board, our staff, our affiliates, One of the 4 pieces of our strategic plan is community building. And by interacting with like-minded people, whether you're just moved to the state and you're interested in preserving what drew you here, or if your family's been here for 3 or 4 generations, as people like to say, or in indigenous communities, 300 or 400 years or more, if your family's been here, we want you at the table. We want you talking to us and interacting with us and bringing your own unique perspective on that which brings us together. So much of what's happening in this country now is designed to push people apart and to divide. And I just really feel fortunate to be working with an organization and a group of people that, what operates us and motivates us is bringing people together, not dividing people, not dividing communities, but bringing people together around common values that really should be timeless. And that's what the Montana Wildlife Federation does. We're just in a really privileged position to work together on those things.
That's the voice of Frank Szollosi. He is the executive director of the Montana Wildlife Federation. And you can become involved as well by visiting montanawildlife.org. Become a member today. And when you become a member, what are some of the things that you might receive in the mail? We also have a package that we send to the youth.
When you become a member, we put out a newsletter 2 or 3 times a year. It's very well done. In this latest version, we do a legislative wrap-up. This is the public lands issue. Oh, look at that. We have feature stories of people who are out hunting and fishing. And so you get a great newsletter. We send you a hat for folks who become lifetime members. We have an agreement with the R.L. Winston Rod Company from Twin Bridges, Montana. We'll send you a Montana-made fly rod of your choice, one of their standard models. You also have the choice of Vortex binoculars. We have something called the 500 Club for people who give $500. They get invited to sort of behind-the-scenes policy briefings. And we invite people to come to our annual meeting once a year and to meet the board. We have folks on the board who are members of the Montana Outdoor Hall of Fame. And they recognize people both living and dead who've made different contributions to the conservation movement in Montana. We brought donors to that in the past and to thank them for their investment. And, like other organizations, particularly with one like ours that has such a storied history going back 90 years and a vision for the next 90 years, we welcome legacy gifts. If Montana's wildlife and habitat and access is something that you want for your children's generation, your grandchildren's generation, and generations to come, think about a legacy gift to the Montana Wildlife Federation so that, those who succeed me have the resources they need to be successful in fulfilling our mission.
Frank, let's end your show with 3 bits of advice that you would share with whoever's listening out there.
When you get up in the morning, before you look at your phone, before you check your email, take a walk outside and get grounded on what makes you human, which makes us all human. It's not our work. It's certainly not technology. It's the air in our lungs and the sunshine on our face. So go out and get some of that good sunshine before you start your day's labor. Second bit of advice, turn the music up real loud. Even if it bums out your neighbors or your parents, music's meant to be played loud. And third, make it a point to try to get to know people who you think you disagree with. I mentioned division, and it's a real problem in these United States right now. It's not unique to our time. There have been divisions for as long as there's been United States. But when we've been successful and we've followed our better angels, it's because we've taken the time to try to get to know people who aren't like us. And so go out of your way to get to know people who aren't like us. And you might be surprised with what you have in common and what you can build on.
Frank, thank you so much for your time and energy joining me on the Trail Less Traveled. And thank you for your leadership with the Montana Wildlife Federation.
Thank you, Mandela.
My name is Kathy Hadley. I'm a board member with the Montana Wildlife Federation, the state's oldest conservation organization. Our roots trace back to 1936, when hunters and anglers joined landowners to address the loss of Montana's natural lands, healthy waters, and abundant wildlife. This week, I want to share a conservation tip. My tip is to use copper bullets for big game hunting. because lead bullet fragments are toxic to humans and to wildlife. In my family, we have hunted and consumed deer and elk for decades. We switched to copper bullets after seeing a photograph of an X-ray of a deer carcass shot with a lead bullet. There were lead bullet fragments all over that carcass. So to protect your family's health, use copper bullets. They work great, and by doing so, you will also be protecting our fish and wildlife resources. For more information and to become a member of the Montana Wildlife Federation, visit montanawildlife.org. That's montanawildlife.org.
Since 1936, the Montana Wildlife Federation has been Montana's most effective wildlife conservation organization. If you care about wildlife, habitat, and public access in Montana, you can become a member of the Montana Wildlife Federation, who will help you effectively use your voice in order to speak up for what some consider to be resources. But at the end of the day, our public lands, waters, and wildlife are life sources. On behalf of the Board of Directors for the Montana Wildlife Federation, I welcome you to join as a member today. It's $40 a year, and that money goes towards bootstrap on-the-ground efforts. Visit montanawildlife.org to learn more. That's it for this week's adventure, my friends in Missoula and around the world. But until next week, please remember, conservation is not a spectator sport. Living in Missoula is a privilege. With privilege comes responsibility. Please get educated and engaged. Speak up on behalf of wildlife and wild places. And if you think you're too small to make a difference, well, then you've never spent the night with a mosquito.